Imagine a young boy playing with his friends in the royal court of Jerusalem. They are roughhousing, pinching each other's arms and laughing. But while the other children cry out in pain, one boy remains silent. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't even blink.
His tutor, the historian William of Tyre, watches from the shadows, his heart sinking. He realizes that this child, the heir to the holiest kingdom on earth, cannot feel pain because his flesh is already dying.
This boy was Baldwin IV, and he would go on to become the most improbable hero of the Crusades, a king who ruled from a litter and defeated the greatest sultan of the East, while his own body withered into dust. To understand the tragedy and the triumph of Baldwin IV, we have to look at the world he was born into. In the mid-12th century, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile island of Christian rule, surrounded by a rising tide of Islamic unification.
Baldwin was born in 1161 to King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. He was handsome, intelligent, and an exceptionally gifted writer, a vital skill for any medieval nobleman. But the discovery of his illness changed everything.
In an age where physical health was seen as a reflection of divine favor, leprosy was a death sentence, both socially and biologically. It was known as the living death.
At the time, leprosy was misunderstood and deeply feared. People believed it was a curse from God, a physical manifestation of sin. Yet, because Baldwin was of royal blood, he was not cast out into a colony. Instead, he was groomed for a throne he was never expected to hold for long.
When his father died unexpectedly in 1174, the 13-year-old Baldwin was crowned king of Jerusalem. He was a child with a rotting nervous system, presiding over a kingdom of squabbling barons, ambitious knights, and a looming external threat that would eventually change the course of history: Saladin.
Saladin was not just any commander. He was a visionary who had successfully united the fractured Muslim world under one banner. His goal was simple and absolute: the recapture of Jerusalem.
He looked at the teenage king across the border and saw a temporary obstacle, a sick boy who would surely fold under the weight of an empire. But Saladin underestimated the sheer iron will of the young man behind the mask.
Baldwin's reign was a race against time. As the leprosy progressed, it began to claim his extremities. He lost the use of his right hand, making it impossible to wield a sword traditionally. He began to lose his sight. His face became scarred and disfigured.
Yet he refused to hide. While later legends and films depict him wearing a silver mask to hide his face, historical accounts suggest he often went uncovered, forcing his court and his enemies to look upon his suffering.
He was a king who led from the front, even when he had to be strapped to his horse because he could no longer grip the saddle with his legs.
The defining moment of Baldwin's life came in 1177. Saladin had crossed the border from Egypt with an army of nearly 30,000 men, a force so massive it seemed invincible. Baldwin gathered what few forces he could find. He had only 500 knights and a few thousand infantrymen. The odds were suicidal. Saladin, confident in his numbers, allowed his army to scatter and pillage the countryside, believing the Christians were too intimidated to strike. He was wrong. Baldwin intercepted the Sultan's main force at a place called Manjasard.
Despite his physical agony, Baldwin dismounted from his horse. In full view of his men, he prostrated himself before a fragment of the true cross, praying for victory. He then rose, was helped back into his saddle, and led the charge.
The result was one of the most stunning military upsets in history. The Crusader heavy cavalry smashed into Saladin's disorganized center. The Sultan's elite bodyguard of Mamluks was cut to pieces, and Saladin himself only escaped by fleeing into the desert on a fast camel.
For a moment, the unstoppable tide of the Ayyubid Empire was broken by a boy king who was supposed to be at death's door. This victory didn't just save Jerusalem for a decade, it cemented Baldwin's reputation as a leader who was touched by something far more powerful than disease.
But the victory at Montgassard could not stop the biological clock. As the years passed, Baldwin's condition deteriorated rapidly. He became blind and unable to use his hands or feet. He couldn't walk, yet he refused to stop governing.
He was carried in a litter between his troops during campaigns. His presence alone was enough to bolster the morale of his soldiers. They saw a man who had every reason to give up, yet chose to endure the sun, the dust, and the pain for the sake of his crown and his faith. The internal politics of Jerusalem were perhaps even more toxic than the leprosy. Because Baldwin had no heirs, the question of succession became a battlefield. His sister Sibylla and her husband, Guy of Lusignan, represented one faction, while other barons fought for influence.
Baldwin watched as the men who were supposed to be his protectors began to circle like vultures. He saw Guy's incompetence and tried to strip him of his regency, but the king's failing health made it difficult to enforce his will.
There is a powerful account of Baldwin's later years when Saladin besieged the castle of Carrick during a royal wedding. Baldwin, though dying and unable to see, ordered his army to march to the castle's relief. When Saladin heard that the Leper King was approaching, even in his crippled state, he chose to withdraw rather than face the ghost-like figure in the litter. There was a profound respect between the two leaders. In 1185, at the age of just 24, Baldwin IV finally succumbed to his illness. He had ruled for 11 years, far longer than any doctor or advisor had predicted. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the final resting place of a man who had sacrificed his entire existence to hold the line against the inevitable. With Baldwin's death, the glue holding the Crusader states together dissolved. Within 2 years, the leadership fell to Guy of Lusignan, whose tactical blunders at the Battle of Hattin led to the total destruction of the Christian army. Saladin finally entered Jerusalem in 1187, the very thing Baldwin had spent his life preventing.
But the legacy of the Leper King isn't found in the fall of the city. It's found in the defiance of the human spirit. Baldwin IV remains a haunting figure in history, a king who was physically the weakest man in his realm, but mentally and spiritually the strongest.
He proved that leadership isn't defined by physical perfection or longevity, but by the will to stand when everyone else expects you to fall. He was the king who refused to be a victim, the commander who turned a death sentence into a legend, and the only man who could make the great Saladin hesitate.
Subscribe for more historical mysteries.